Access to Democracy is made possible thanks to the following organizations. Recalibra Health, a new nationwide telehealth platform designed to provide safe and effective health and wellness products at affordable prices. Available products include compound GLP-1 for weight loss, as well as multiple medications for men's and women's health and hair loss, all administered under the direct supervision of expert physicians, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants. Visit recalibrahealth.com for more information. Sheridan and Dulas, PA, a family and criminal defense law firm, has been serving clients in Dakota County and throughout Minnesota for over 40 years. Ranked a Tier 1 Best Law Firm by U.S. News & World Report every year since 2009. Sheridan and Dulas are here to help you in your most difficult life circumstances. Learn more at ssdpa.com. Established in 2007 and based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, 45th Parallel Distillery was among the first 50 micro distilleries in the United States. All aspects of production occur at their facility. If you're interested in learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check their website and plan a visit to tour their facility and taste their spirits. 45thParallelDistillery.com. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has been proudly serving its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to watch our program. I'm pleased to welcome back to our studio today someone who has been on our program previously, about a year ago or a little over a year ago, I believe. Today we're pleased to have Julia Decker, who is the Director of Public Policy for the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. Julia, welcome back to Access to Democracy.
All right, thank you for having me.
So this topic, we're going to have a lot to talk about today, but before we start getting into the nuts and bolts of some of the immigration issues and legal issues that are in the news these days, give us a brief overview of what is the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, when did it begin, and who are the people that you serve?
Sure. So Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota, or ILCM, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We primarily provide direct immigration legal services, so free legal services to low-income immigrants and refugees in Minnesota and also in North Dakota. We are coming up on our 30-year anniversary soon, so we have been doing this for quite some time now. And so we do a lot of different types of cases, everything from citizenship and green cards all the way to defending people in immigration court, and everything in between.
And how many staff do you have? How many staff attorneys and other support staff do you know?
I'm not even sure. I mean, we have been growing very recently. I would say it's probably over 20 or so, just in terms of legal staff and assistants and lawyers and so on and so forth, as well as obviously policy staff and communication staff, development staff, all of whom play very critical roles in making sure.
And you are the public policy director for
Yes.
ILCM, but you're also an attorney, and you've also worked on immigration cases both at ILCM and I believe you worked previously at ACLU. Is that correct? Yeah,
yes.
Right. So describe for us just briefly, what has it been like for yourself and the attorneys at ILCM since Operation Metro Surge?
Yeah, so I would say it's been, I think, for our attorneys, for our staff, as well as obviously for people in Minnesota generally, it's been pretty overwhelming the last few months since not only the beginning of the surge, but of course just since the new administration came in. But the surge really amped up everything, right? We saw very on-the-ground, immediate and direct impacts. And for direct violence against our communities and right in our neighborhoods and on the ground. And so that was a really a really difficult time for our communities, for the people that we serve, for the clients that we have, and also for our staff, right? The people who live right in these communities that were being impacted, and for staff who are directly impacted people as well.
And so what I'm hearing, if I'm hearing you correctly, a surge in the number of clients seeking assistance with legal issues, whether it's final deportation orders or perhaps involving asylum cases or requests, those types of issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly we saw people who we are already serving who were impacted, whether they were picked up or had questions about, well, what happens if I am, contacted by one of these many agents who are in our streets. We have a hotline for people who are detained by ICE. We've been running that for many years, but of course, we saw a massive increase in the number of people who were detained by immigration enforcement agents. And so people were calling that line with much more frequency and requesting assistance, requesting information. Oftentimes it was people requesting information about somebody who had been detained, because what we saw, of course, during the surge was people, when they were taken by ICE, we had no information about these people.
They weren't allowed to make phone calls?
Correct.
There was
often no information. There is, for instance, like an ICE detainee locator online that's supposed to be updated with people's information. But of course, with the amount of people that were being detained, and we started to see sort of backups of people being detained at the Whipple building. I mean, there was complete chaos, essentially, and breakdown of sort of information and lack of transparency. And so we just saw inundation of information and calls of people, saying, I have a person, my friend, brother, spouse, partner, whatever, here's their name, here's their information, I don't know where they are. And that became one of just the many pieces of this, was just trying to locate people, figure out where they've been taken. And then, of course, we saw not only were they being maybe taken somewhere in Minnesota, but we started to see people being taken out of state as well.
So
it
Texas,
just was,
and were there other states that people were being sent to as well?
Primarily Texas was the main one, but we also saw like New Mexico, sometimes even Louisiana, other states. I mean, it was chaos.
And what we saw happen here, by the way, this Operation Metro Surge, it actually began, I believe, in December of last year, right? So it actually predated, it was before the big news, which occurred in January, and obviously with the tragic shooting deaths of Renee Good and Alex Preddy on the streets of Minneapolis. But were you seeing situations too where you had clients that were being denied access to their attorneys, not able to contact you for legal assistance?
So to sort of, I guess, paint a picture, right? The issues of access for clients in detention and people in detention generally, in immigration detention, have always been sort of a lingering issue in the immigration system. That has always been something of a concern, because people in the detention system face varying barriers in terms of being able to access counsel and access, outside resources and stuff like that. So that is, even before this administration, even before the surge, all of these things, that was always an issue.
So it's been treated as somewhat ambiguous whether or not people have the right to access counsel?
So it's one of these things where there is a right to an attorney, in the sense that, yes, people have the right to access counsel in theory, right? It is stated during a person's first immigration court hearing. You have a right to an attorney. It's not paid for by the government because it's not a criminal court hearing. But so the immigration judge will say you have a right to an attorney. If you can go and find one, right? But in practice, there are many, many detention centers across the country. Some of those detention centers, maybe their phones are broken, or maybe they require people to pay to call.
Make a phone call.
Yeah, and maybe different people are not going to have people out on the outside who can put money onto their books in order to make that phone call. Maybe it's just they are on lockdown for days at a time because of various facility issues, right? I mean, so the ideal is there. right? The right to access. Putting into practice is a whole nother question.
Yeah,
So
that seems like
yeah.
such a fundamental part of due process of law. I mean,
Absolutely.
with criminal defendants, you know, the Miranda rights, you have a right to an attorney, and if you can't afford one, one will be provided. But this is in a different context, so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the legal rights that immigrant people, undocumented people, do and don't have when they're in the U.S.
Sure.
Now, it seems I've seen a lot of misinformation online. And it goes somewhat along these lines. People say, well, you entered the U.S. illegally. You have no legal rights in the U.S. That's not true, is it?
It's not true at all.
Explain what rights people have regardless of their legal or undocumented status.
So undocumented people have constitutional rights. I think that should
If
be
they're in the United States.
Yep,
Anybody
in the United States.
in the
Anybody in the
States.
United States. And I think that that has to be the starting point. And we have seen this sort of back and forth in a lot of different contexts, right? We've seen it maybe in like congressional hearings. I know I've seen it in like state legislative hearings, even where somebody will sort of assert this, and you have to have even sort of a pushback with somebody about like, no, like people have constitutional rights in the United States, you know, regardless of their status. And, you know, I think the other sort of maybe nuance here that is, you know, undocumented also can have a lot of sort of nuance to it, because people can be undocumented but not necessarily have entered the country without status. People can have lost their status, their visa might have expired. There are different ways that people can be undocumented. They might be waiting for their application to be approved.
So this is not one size fits all.
Absolutely
Everyone's
not.
circumstances are quite different. How about the right to remain silent? If ICE officer
Fifth Amendment
demands that you answer questions, they don't have to answer, do they?
Right,
They
this
have
is
a
the
right
Fifth
to
Amendment.
remain silent, and the burden of proof is on the government to prove that somebody is in the country in an illegal or undocumented status.
Yeah, so this gets into, I mean, so we get into a little bit of like some like legal advice here. So I would say, like, you know, if somebody is in a position where they are like specifically asking for like legal advice on this, like talk to your attorney.
Right.
But, right, generally speaking, you know, right to remain silent is your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, right? So like, if you are, that's sort of the ACLU, for instance, like sort of general guidance is like, you have these rights if you are confronted by a law enforcement officer.
And the Immigrant Law Center, your webpage actually has
Yep,
discussion in there about,
yep.
you know, for immigrants who may have questions about what their legal rights are. Which
Absolutely.
I looked at that before we did this interview today. It's actually pretty thorough discussion of what people's rights are. Talk to us for a moment, if you would, about what we hear about people having habeas hearings, which shorthand for habeas corpus, Latin meaning, if I remember my law school Latin, bring the body, present the body.
Yes.
Which explain what the concept of habeas corpus is.
So this is a writ, a petition that can be brought in court primarily around issues where somebody is being detained by the state, by the government, and they want to sort of say, I don't think I should be detained. And it has, you know, historically we think about detention, jail, prison being sort of criminal proceedings. Typically that's how we think of it. But in the immigration context, of course, that also applies. We see people being detained in immigration. And what we saw with the current administration recently, there was a sort of sea change in the way the government was approaching detention. They said, we think there is a whole category of people that we didn't previously subject to mandatory detention that we are now going to try to subject to mandatory detention. We think these people should be always detained, no exceptions. We're going to keep them in detention the entire time that they are fighting their deportation cases, regardless of whether they have any type of criminal record, regardless of any type of public safety concerns or flight risk. And so that was a big change. And so what this sort of gave rise to was a whole new sort of, you know, run of lawyers saying, hey, let's try and use let's try and file some habeas cases for these folks, because we think that this might be a new way to
that the
try and
government's
challenge
exceeding
some of
its
these. Yep.
authority because they're
Yep.
not acting on statutes passed by Congress. This is more in the nature of an executive action or administration policy, right, rather than statutory requirement.
Right. There was what's called a Board of Immigration Appeals decision, which is administrative court within the Department of Justice that was interpreting or essentially deciding a particular statute within the Immigration and Nationality Act around mandatory detention. And so they said, okay, we think that this is how this should apply to this new group of people. And there has been litigation since then, and there's still a whole bunch of court stuff going on around this. But as this stuff has all been sort of happening, lawyers, in our infinite wisdom, as we do, decided, hey, let's find this a different pathway through the courts to try and find relief for folks who are sitting in detention centers. And so habeas corpus was one of these pathways to trying to get people out of detention, immigration detention. And it has been successful in a lot of ways. There has now been a court decision in Texas in the federal court in the Fifth Circuit, as well as a court decision here in the Eighth Circuit that affects Minnesota as well as some other states that may make some of those decisions more difficult, or may make some of those petitions more difficult. But again, litigation is ongoing.
Right. And
Remains to be
subject to
seen.
reviews further up
exactly.
course of the appeals process.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, at the height of Operation Surge, there was a lot of apprehension and, frankly, anger by a lot of Minnesotans by what they saw playing out on their televisions. We saw an elderly man in St. Paul, I believe he was Hmong, who was dragged out of his home in his pajamas and slippers and was detained, subsequently released. We saw American citizens being dragged out of their vehicles, and 2 employees of a Target store in Richfield, who it was learned later were American citizens. So I want to ask you, a number of these people, many of these people who were detained and not immediately released, ended up at the Whipple building at Fort Snelling. Now, Congresswoman Kelly Morrison and Angie Craig here from the 2nd District, I believe Betty McCollum, during Operation Surge, demanded to be allowed to enter the Whipple building to inspect the facility in their role as U.S. representatives. Initially, they were denied. But my understanding is Congresswoman Morrison, she did ultimately get in there and came out with very disturbing report about the conditions inside the Whipple building in terms of hygiene, lack of clean facilities, inadequate bedding provided, and there are adults and children in there. What have you heard from clients, perhaps, about the conditions in the Whipple building?
So I can't speak specifically about client communications just because those would be privileged confidential. But the Whipple building itself is not meant to be a detention center. It was never meant to be a detention center. It's the place where the immigration court is. It's the place where people might be held for a very short time if they are being sort of processed, maybe fingerprinted, or if they're waiting for their immigration court hearing. Never meant to be a detention center. And this is a pattern that we have seen in other cities where there were major enforcement actions, where these sort of temporary facilities became de facto detention centers, and then the conditions rapidly deteriorated because they were not meant to be detention centers at all. And I think that the Whipple building, that's what we saw here. And so, it was, appalling, and also in some ways not surprising in the sense that, of course, Whipple is not, to the extent. I mean, I think it's right. Like, you can say, well, it's not a detention center. It's like, well, detention is also terrible in the sense that we see the conditions are terrible.
People weren't free to come and go, and they couldn't have visitors there. And the reports from Congresswoman Morrison were frankly quite alarming
Yeah.
to a lot of people, and
Yeah.
certainly an area where there needs to be more congressional oversight and holding ICE officials accountable for that. Another issue that came up during Operation Surge, we heard a lot of talk about the warrant requirements. The Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, people cannot be seized off the street without probable cause or without an arrest warrant. And we heard discussion about something called an administrative warrant versus a judicial warrant. Can you tell us, Julia, what is the difference between an administrative warrant that ICE was using as justification to go into homes and businesses versus a judicial warrant? What's the difference?
Yeah, at baseline, it's who signs it. The judicial warrants are signed by a judge. Administrative warrants are often signed by someone other than a judge. You might have like an ICE officer or something like that sign an administrative warrant. And basically that is sort of the authority difference.
But doesn't it really, the judge, in the case where you have a federal judge signing a warrant or a magistrate, they're not connected to the agency, to ICE. So doesn't it seem like, isn't it a conflict of interest for an ICE judge to be signing a warrant saying, yeah, we have the right to go in here?
Right, and that's why the administrative, that's why there was so much kerfuffle. Kerfuffle is sort of underplaying it, but that's why there was so much concern over this idea that an administrative warrant could somehow provide the level of ability for federal law enforcement to enter somebody's private residence, because it's not signed by a independent judicial authority. Right.
Who is impartial, not in fact an employee of the agency.
Right.
And now we've just heard news reports about the administration moving to crack down on some of these immigration judges if they don't like the decisions they're making. And I think they're talking about administrative law judges who work for the agencies.
Right.
Is that right? What are your thoughts about that? Is this something that people should be worried about when the administration's trying to retaliate against judges because they don't like the decisions that they're rendering in immigration cases?
So there's always been, there has always been some concern, right, about the immigration courts, just because they are located within the Department of Justice. And so the immigration judges are inherently part of the administration, whatever administration it is, which means that there is less independence, and therefore, there's more potential for influence from the political branches of government if they are within the executive branch. That is just the reality of the system of our, having an administrative court within the executive branch of government, as opposed to being in the independent judiciary. What we have seen, of course, with this current administration is an increased influence and an increased, willingness to exert influence over this particular piece of the system. And I think there's actually been a study done, or some statistical analysis done by, I think it might have been NPR actually, on sort of the rate of approvals or denials, et cetera, on by some of the immigration judges, and it's sort of a staggering denial rate for on appeal and by judges, and it's been widely reported on that judges who do not sort of toe the line are removed from the immigration bench.
Shouldn't the overarching public value here be that we don't want judges, whether they're administrative law judges or lifetime tenured federal judges, to be subject to political pressure? We want them making decisions based on the law, right, rather than political pressure.
I think that we would hope that would be the value that we would want to uphold within a judicial type of system. And unfortunately, that is something that we are not seeing appear to be upheld under the current system.
I want to ask you about, we talked earlier about this just briefly, and I want to circle back to it. Different people in different situations. There are actually multiple different ways that people enter the U.S. legally, different types of visas.
Yes.
Talk to us about what some of those different types of visas are.
There is and I am not exaggerating, there is an entire alphabet of visas that people can come to the United States on. And many of them are temporary visas that could be as anything from like a diplomat to an athlete to an entrepreneur. At one point, there was a visa for a sheep herder. That may still exist, I'm not sure. You know, there
the ones
are...
I think that people think of immediately are like work visas.
Sure.
And student visas.
Student
to come
visas,
attend an American
sure.
college
Student
or
visas,
university.
visitor visa, tourist visa. And you know, some people may enter the United States on those types of visas. People also enter the United States certainly as like a refugee. People can enter the United States as a fiancé. There's a fiancé visa. You know, there are just a multitude of different ways. And
then we have a whole other category in immigration law of people in the asylum process,
Yes.
which is again something very different than the regular immigration process for people trying to come into the country who may ultimately want to become U.S. citizens, right? Asylum has a different standard for assessing eligibility for admission.
In some ways, right? So it's a little bit nuanced. This is the lawyer's answer, but so a person can apply for asylum in a couple different. There's a couple different tracks, I would say, for asylum. A person who enters the United States in whatever way they enter, whether it's with or without permission, can apply for asylum with the U.S. government within 1 year of their entry, whether it was with or without permission. And at that point, they are in the application process. If they have contact with immigration at the border, or they present themselves to an official at the border and say, I'm seeking asylum, I'm afraid to return to my country,
right.
Then they go to...
Isn't there something called a standard about a well-founded fear of persecution as the key language?
Yep, then they would go
asylum?
to immigration court and they would present their case in immigration court. And it's about well-founded fear of persecution. It is the same standard that refugees have to meet. Refugees, though, are found to have met that standard outside the United States.
Right. And then there's something that the Biden administration used called temporary protected status, which I believe was used for Ukrainian refugees that were admitted to the U.S. after Russia invaded Ukraine, right?
So it wasn't used specifically for refugees. So refugees would have already been admitted in refugee status. Temporary protected status is for people who are already in the United States and they can't go back. They can stay longer.
Okay.
Because the situation in the country of origin has undergone some sort of natural disaster or civil unrest or a war. And so the people in the United States, whatever status they might have, can stay with work authorization for the time period of temporary protected status.
I think our viewers get a sense, Julia, from this discussion. Immigration law is actually very complex, very complicated, subject to lots of changes. We're down to less than a minute. I want to ask you real quickly, I hope this isn't unfair.
No.
Bing, bing, bing. What would you do if you were in Congress and could write an immigration reform bill? What would be the top 3 things you would do in an immigration reform bill?
Oh, no. This is...
Are you able to answer that?
Oh, I wish...
If you can't, that's okay, because, I mean, we just talked about the complexity of it. We're going to have you back on the show to talk in some more detail about this.
I think we could do a whole show just on that.
Just on what probably needs to be in the next iteration of immigration reform, if we get a Congress and a president that ever want to undertake that.
Exactly.
Julia Decker, Public Policy Director for the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. Thank you for coming on to talk about immigration issues and Operation Metro Surge.
Thank you so much.
And we'll have you back on the show again. Thank you for coming on Access to Democracy.
Thank you for having me.